Welcome everyone to the Step Learning Collaborative Family Education Series. This is our talk on caring for the carer, the outline for today's talk. We're going to move through a few key areas. We'll start with a very brief overview of psychosis. We do this every session just to make sure that folks have a shared understanding of the experiences we're talking about. Then we'll talk about the caregiving role, why it matters and why it can be challenging. We'll look at common experiences that caregivers often report, including emotional, social, and practical impacts. And from there, we'll shift towards supporting caregiver well-being, including strategies that caregivers themselves have found helpful. And finally, we'll talk about some practical skills and resources that you can follow up on after today's session. And so on the next slide, I want to take a moment to frame this talk, what it is and what it isn't. We know from a large body of research that caregivers play such a pivotal role in recovery for people experiencing psychosis. The care, patience, and advocacy that family members provide can make a huge difference. At the same time, what caregivers themselves go through can be extremely challenging, and it can have significant impacts on one's own well-being, relationships, and daily life. So the focus of today's talk is really about how we understand and support caregivers themselves so that they can sustain our own well-being while continuing to support our loved ones. And so as we've done, we'll do a brief overview of psychosis. We recognize that we might have some new folks joining today, so just to level set, if there's more information that you'd like on this, we have ample resources and recorded webinars that go into much more detail on this background information. So the Step Learning Collaborative focuses on first episode psychosis. And when I say that, I'm simply referring to the first time or within the first couple years that someone starts to experience what we consider full psychotic symptoms. For some individuals, these experiences appear suddenly. For others, they might develop gradually over months or even, 1 to 3 years. In early psychosis programs like STEP, we often focus on the first 3 years following the onset of full psychotic symptoms because research shows this as a kind of a critical period, and that early treatment during this period can have a major impact on long-term outcomes. But if a young person's getting into care after that, it doesn't mean that treatment won't help. It's absolutely still beneficial for folks' recovery and long-term goals and trajectory. Another important point is that diagnostic clarity often takes time. There are many possible causes of psychosis. The most common cause is a mental health condition like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. But clinicians do need time to understand exactly what is happening. And so that's an expected part of early assessment, early engagement, early treatment. But treatment doesn't need to wait for the perfect diagnosis or diagnostic certainty. The goal early on is to stabilize symptoms and support functioning while the picture becomes clearer over time. And so I just want to cover briefly what is psychosis. It refers to experiences where someone may have difficulty distinguishing what's real from what's not real. That's really the crux of it, this difficulty with reality testing. As I mentioned, it most commonly occurs in the context of mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, sometimes a bipolar disorder or other mood disorders. These experiences can feel very real and convincing to the person going through them, even if others around them do not share the same perceptions. Psychosis can include several different kinds of symptoms. We'll touch on a few of them here. Most commonly, or most kind of recognizable would be what we call positive symptoms. And those include things such as hallucinations. So that's any sensory modality can be affected, potentially hearing voices, seeing things that others don't see, even smelling, tasting, feeling things that others are not perceiving. Other individuals might experience delusions, which are strongly held beliefs that are not consistent with reality. These can really vary from things that are ranging from bizarre and implausible, like an alien has implanted a chip into my head, to something very realistic, such as my partner is cheating on me. There can also be changes in thinking and communication, right? We refer to schizophrenia spectrum disorders as thought disorders. So there can be disorganized communication, some difficulty concentrating. You might notice a young person withdrawing from their typical social activities or other disruptions in their school or work. One particularly challenging aspect for families and for clinicians alike is that many people experiencing psychosis may have what we call limited insight, meaning they might not recognize that their experiences are related to an illness or that they might need help and that these experiences are impacting their life in negative ways. This can make communication and support especially difficult. So that was our background on psychosis. At this point, we want to shift our focus um, about the people providing care and support around that experience, which I hope we're joined by many of those folks today in our audience. So here we want to slow down and focus on individuals who are doing the day-to-day caregiving. Many people don't necessarily think of themselves as caregivers. They simply see themselves primarily as a parent, sibling, partner, or friend. But when someone close to us develops a serious mental health condition, those relationships often take on additional responsibilities and emotional demands. So this section is really about recognizing that role and understanding why it can feel so challenging. So when we use the word caregiver here, we're generally referring to informal, unpaid support provided by family members or loved ones. Caregivers often take on tasks that might otherwise be handled by professionals, things like emotional support, helping with treatment appointments, managing medications, coordinating services, and responding during moments of crisis. Importantly, this role usually exists within existing relationships, right? So, for example, a parent may still see themselves primarily as a parent, but the realities of supporting someone through a serious mental illness may involve additional responsibilities that go beyond typical parenting roles. Recognizing that additional lift can be important because it can help explain why the caregiving experience can feel so demanding. Mm. So, why are caregivers so important? There is strong research evidence showing that supportive caregiving environments are are associated with better outcomes for individuals experiencing psychosis. So, for example, when caregivers are supported and able to provide consistent care, we often see improvements such as better medication adherence, fewer relapses of symptoms, and fewer hospitalizations. People may also experience improvements in their quality of life, their ability to work or study, and reduce substance use. So we know this, and I don't need to be telling you all, but just in case you do need to hear it, caregivers are incredibly important partners in the recovery process. And at the same time, this also means that caregivers themselves need support, education, and resources because this role can be very demanding. So, another reason caregivers are so important is that patterns of interactions with families can influence illness, how an illness progresses, especially during stressful periods. This is not to say that family members are responsible for the onset or cause of illness, but as we've talked about in past sessions, families can really hopefully be empowered to have a positive influence on the environment through their interactions with their loved one. So, research has found that when families experience very high levels of stress or emotional intensity, it can sometimes contribute to a more difficult illness course. This includes patterns like high levels of criticism, hostility, or emotional overinvolvement. It's really important to recognize that these responses from a parent or caregiver are most commonly arising from fear, exhaustion, and deep care for the person, certainly not from any intention to cause harm or exacerbation of symptoms. So, understanding these dynamics can help families learn strategies that can reduce stress in the household and support recovery while hopefully also supporting their own well being. Before we go any further, just wanted to take a look. It can be helpful to look at who caregivers often are, just to give it some context. Caregivers really can be anyone. There isn't a single profile. People providing care may be parents, siblings, partners, extended family, close friends. That said, research does show some common patterns. Many caregivers tend to be middle-aged adults, often supporting a young person who's experiencing psychosis during late adolescence or early adulthood. And those individuals also may be in this kind of sandwich generation where they might also be caring for an aging parent of their own. Caregivers are more often women, although men also take on this role. In terms of relationships to the young person, parents make up the largest group of caregivers. It's not surprising, given that many first episodes of psychosis occur when young people are still living at home or closely connected with their families of origin. Socioeconomic backgrounds vary widely, but we do see that caregiving responsibilities can place greater strain on families with fewer financial resources, simply because there may be fewer supports available. And of course, this may not represent or reflect your situation exactly. As I said, caregivers come in all forms, and each caregiving experience is unique. The main point here is that a lot of different people step into this role, often unexpectedly, when someone they care about becomes unwell. So before we move on to Aisha's section on the impacts of caregiving, I do want to just pause on this idea of parenting and the caregiving role, because this slide often resonates strongly with families. I know I've already mentioned this additional lift, which I'm sure caregivers in the audience understand and feel. Um, for many people, the word caregiver can actually feel a little uncomfortable. Again, most parents don't think of themselves that way. They simply see themselves as doing what love and responsibility ask of them. And that's absolutely true. In most cases, the role grows naturally out of an existing relationship, particularly between parents and their children. At the same time, when someone develops a serious mental illness like psychosis, the nature of that role can shift. The responsibilities can begin to include things that go beyond what we typically expect in parenting. For example, families might find themselves learning about the mental health system, new medications, researching different treatment options. There can be moments of crisis, navigating services, coordinating care, or helping their loved one manage symptoms that are confusing and frightening. Emotionally, many caregivers describe a sense of constant vigilance, watching for changes, worrying about relapse, and trying to anticipate what might happen next. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that there can also be stigma and isolation, where families feel that people around them, even within their own family, don't fully understand what they're going through. So the point of this slide isn't to separate parenting from caregiving. In reality, we know that those roles are so deeply intertwined, but instead it's really about recognizing the many additional demands and the unpredictability of the nature that can come with supporting someone through psychosis, and acknowledging why it can feel so heavy at times. So we're recognizing that reality is an important step in making sure that caregivers themselves can receive the support they need and deserve.
So now we're going to speak about the toll and impact caregiving can have when you're taking care of a loved one who is living with psychosis. And so, before we talk about strategies for supporting a young person with early psychosis, it's important to pause and acknowledge the impact that experience can have on caregivers themselves. And so, caregivers are impacted in a multitude of ways, and one of the most significant areas is psychological. And so, research consistently shows that caring for someone with psychosis can place a substantial emotional and mental health strain on families. Studies have shown that about 30 to 50% of parents report that their own mental health has been negatively impacted by the caregiving role, often describing, chronic stress and ongoing emotional strain. We also know that clinical levels of depression have been identified in roughly 40 to 60% of caregivers in some studies, Caregivers also frequently report burnout and emotional exhaustion at levels similar to those experienced by psychiatric professionals working in high intensity clinical settings. When researchers compare caregiving across different conditions, they often find that caregivers supporting individuals with psychosis report higher levels of stress than caregivers supporting people with many other chronic health conditions. And it's important to remember that the caregiving role for parents of children with psychosis often involves not just emotional strain, but also financial and social challenges as well. Parents frequently face high levels of stress, financial pressure, and sometimes social isolation, and many need substantial support to navigate these impacts. And so these statistics really highlight the importance of strong support systems and resources for families, which is part of what programs like STEP aims to provide. So, building on what we had just discussed about the psychological impact, caregiving can also have significant effect on family relationships and social life. And so, one area we often see is family strain. So, when a young person is experiencing psychosis, the entire family system is affected. And so, families may be navigating uncertainty, changes in roles and responsibilities, and differences in how family members respond to the situation. Um, Research also shows that about up to half of families with a member experiencing severe mental illness reported increased family conflict or strain. Another common experience is social withdrawal or isolation. So many parents describe having less time and energy for social relationships because caregiving can also be so demanding and sometimes very draining. We also know that stigma around mental health can sometimes make it harder to talk openly with friends or extended family. And so studies have shown that up to 40% of caregivers report feeling socially isolated as a result of these pressures. Again, these reactions are very common and very understandable. And so caring for a loved one with psychosis can really reshape family dynamics and social connections in ways that many caregivers aren't really fully prepared for. So another area where caregiving can have a major impact is financially. And so many families face additional costs related to medical care, therapy, medications, transportation to appointments, and other treatment-related needs. Research has shown that families often incur out-of-pocket expenses that can reach several thousands dollars each year. Of course, the exact financial impact can vary widely depending on insurance coverage, available resources, and the needs of the young person, but financial uncertainty is a very common experience for many families. I'd also say that caregiving can also affect work and employment. And so some parents find that the time and flexibility required to support their child means they need to make significant changes to their work situation. So what we do know is that studies have shown that 20 to 30% of parents report making major work-related adjustments and changes. So like reducing their work hours, taking unpaid leave, or even in some cases, like having to leave their job entirely. And so, alongside the more emotional and social aspects we talked about earlier, many families are also navigating very real practical and financial pressures as part of the caregiving role. And so, we're going to talk about some of the most common caregiving experiences in this section. However, again, we do want to recognize that not everyone has the same experience or situation, but you may be able to see parts of yourselves in the next part of this workshop. Oops. There we go. So for this slide, it kind of outlines what we sometimes think of as a common like roadmap of the caregiving experience when a young person develops psychosis. And so not every family's experience will look exactly like this, but many caregivers recognize part of this journey. And so when we start with the pre-diagnosis phase, loved ones often experience a lot of worry, fear, and confusion while trying to understand what is happening. And so when changes in behavior or thinking begin to emerge, families may not yet have a clear explanation. During this time, it's very, very common to feel overwhelmed by a range of emotions, which would be fear, anger, frustration, or even despair. It can also feel like a very heartbreaking experience. And so these are very normal reactions when something serious seems to be happening and you have no idea what is going on, at least not yet. For many families, this period can also involve fast moving and sometimes very intense experiences such as emergency evaluations, hospital visits, or even interactions with mental health services that you may have never encountered before. And so that can also feel very confusing and intimidating, even very traumatic for some caregivers as well. We also have the diagnosis phase. And so for some families, receiving a diagnosis can bring a sense of relief because it provides an explanation and a clearer path forward. You finally have some sort of direction and maybe even an answer. It can create a sense of hope that symptoms can be treated and managed. At the exact same time, this phase can also be very overwhelming because families are often asked to quickly learn about medications, treatment options, and mental health services while still processing everything that has happened. We also have the recovery stage, which is kind of the final part of it, but recovery from psychosis is often not a straight line and it can take time. Psychosis is a medical condition, and the brain needs time and support to recover. And so, something that we would like to emphasize here at STEP is that caregivers go through their own recovery process as well. Families often need time to process the events that occurred and make sense of the experience, and also adjust to a new understanding of what recovery and support might look like moving forward. So, I would say that this slide highlights maybe some of the common experience that caregivers often describe when supporting a young person with psychosis. Again, not everyone will relate to all of these, but many families recognize at least some of these feelings along the way. And so, one experience that often comes is a sense of grief or mourning, sometimes for the young person, sometimes for the relationship, sometimes for the future that families had imagined. And so, when an illness emerges, it can disrupt expectations about independence, school, work, or life plans. And so those feelings of loss are very common and very understandable. And it's important that caregivers have space and support to process them. Another experience many families report is self-blame. And so because psychosis and other serious mental health conditions are typically misunderstood for a very long time, some parents do question and wonder if they did something wrong or could have prevented it. And so we want to be very clear here that psychosis is not caused by parenting or by family relationships. Families also often describe the challenge of adjusting roles within the relationship. So many young people who develop psychosis are at a stage where they were becoming more independent. And so when symptoms emerge, they may temporarily need more support again, which can be a difficult shift for both the young person and the caregivers to navigate. There can also be a very steep learning curve. And so families often find themselves quickly learning about medications, treatment services, and how to navigate a very complex and not so linear mental health system. Many caregivers also become strong advocates for their loved one as they coordinate care and try to make sure the young person receives the supports they need. And finally, many caregivers describe a sense of isolation, wondering whether others truly understand what they're going through or whether anyone is really listening, as Dr. Sykes said. Because all of this, it's really important for caregivers to have their own outlets for support, whether that's therapy, support groups, journaling, or other spaces where these emotions can be processed. One thing that we often encourage families to keep in mind is just to maybe like temporary lower expectations while also still holding on to long-term hope and aspirations. Caregiving is really hard and recovery can take time, and progress is often easier to see when we focus on small steps forward from day to day, from week to week, or even month to month, rather than comparing things to how they were before the illness or even symptoms began. So this slide highlights some things that many caregivers experience, which is caregiver stress and burnout. And so supporting someone with a serious mental health condition can place ongoing demands on your time, attention, and emotional energy. And so over time, it's very common for caregivers to begin noticing stress responses like increased anxiety or worry, feeling physically run down, difficulty sleeping, or find that it's harder to focus or even concentrate. Some caregivers also notice that they have a shorter fuse than usual, so feeling more easily frustrated or reactive. Um, Often those reactions are actually rooted in fear, concern, worry, and the pressure of trying to just manage so many responsibilities at once, and understandably so. And so one thing that can happen is this kind of like negative cycle. And so when caregivers are feeling overwhelmed or exhausted, it becomes harder to keep up with things that normally support well-being. So things like rest or exercise, social connection, or even simply taking time to recharge. And so people often say things like, there isn't time, or I'm just too tired. And it's important to say that those concerns are often very, very real. There may be no time. Many caregivers are balancing work, family responsibilities, and navigating the mental health system all at the same time. And so the goal here isn't to tell that caregivers should somehow add a long list of self-care tasks like, lighting up a candle or taking a bath to a already overwhelming schedule. But instead, it's really just to recognize this pattern. So when all of your energy goes outwards for a long time, eventually there isn't much left to sustain yourself. And so sometimes that shift is simply about very, very small support. So moments of rest, asking for help, connecting with someone who understands, or learning a few tools that make difficult situations a little easier to manage. And so even small changes can help interrupt the cycle and make caregiving more sustainable over time. We also want to spend some time focusing on what caregivers have found helpful while supporting a young person with psychosis. And so, one of the biggest themes that comes up is supporting your own well-being. And so, caregiving in this context is often more like a marathon than a sprint. And it can be really helpful to take things one step at a time and one day at a time, especially because the needs of your young person and their caregiving role itself can change over time. And so, getting a handle on self-care is really key here. When we spend a lot of our emotional and physical energy supporting someone else, that energy eventually needs to be replenished. And so, if our own health begins to suffer, it becomes much harder to sustain the support we want to give. In many ways, taking care of yourself is a part of taking care of your loved one. And that can look like staying mentally and physically well. So things like exercise, sleep, nutrition, connecting with friends or family, or um, obtaining access to individual therapy or even caregiver support groups. And so at the same time, we also want to acknowledge something important is that it can sometimes feel too difficult to hear suggestions like this when you're already overwhelmed. Some caregivers feel like they simply don't have time or energy or emotional bandwidth to engage in self-care right now, even if they know it's important. And if that's where you are, that is perfectly okay. Self-care does not have to mean something big or time-consuming. It can look different for everyone. And sometimes it's about taking more like small and intentional moments or actions throughout the day. So this could even just making sure that you're eating dinner or eating dinner at a reasonable time, trying to drink more water, texting a friend who cares about you, or even taking a short walk around the block, or listening to music, or just a few moments to yourself, whatever that may mean to you. Some caregivers also find it helpful to reclaim small pockets of time when possible. It may feel hard at first to schedule it in, but if it's feasible and possible, like having even just like smaller, but also bigger moments. So like a weekly activity, like dinner with a friend or a yoga class, um, doing a paint night. And so simply doing something that helps you feel a sense of joy, rest, or peace in any capacity. And another area that caregivers often find empowering is learning about the illness and the systems of care. And so, education about psychosis, medications, available services can help caregivers feel more confident in navigating the system. And so, many families also benefit from building skills that support the young person and themselves, and from developing positive relationships with treatment providers and services. And so, caring for someone else is important, but also you are someone who deserves care and support as well during this time.
Thanks, Aisha. So we've just covered a lot, right? We've covered who caregivers are, the various ways that folks might be commonly impacted. And it's a pretty heavy beginning to this workshop, and we want to acknowledge that. And we it was intentional again, as we can't say enough that not everyone's experience is the same, but we've gotten feedback in the past, and that's why we created this workshop, is that folks wanted to see their caregiving experience represented and acknowledged. And so we don't mean to say all these negatively valenced things to make it, depressing or things like that, but we do just want to acknowledge the reality for many folks. And if you don't fit this, that's okay. It doesn't mean that it's coming. There's different things and journeys that folks experience, and also part of, you know, as Aisha mentioned, the Step Learning Collaborative and the ethos of early intervention is that we hope to kind of get in there as early as possible and minimize distress, functional impact, burden, and all the impacts that schizophrenia and psychosis can have, both on the individual and on the family and caregiver. So if this beginning felt very heavy, that is real and intentional. And now we do want to purposely shift to discussing some skills that caregivers might be able to implement to help cope. Again, that we're going to list a lot of different things. It doesn't mean that you can immediately implement all of those, but this is an available resource for you. And we wanted to share some things that hopefully can feel supportive and empowering. And so first thing I want to talk about, which can be a difficult concept, is acceptance. It's one that many caregivers say becomes really important over time. And so this idea of acceptance, when we talk about it, we're not talking about liking the situation or thinking that it's fair. Many families, as we've mentioned, understandably feel grief, anger, or frustration that their loved one has developed a serious mental illness. So acceptance simply means acknowledging the reality of the illness, acknowledging the caregiving role that you might find yourself in, as well as the changes that it might bring, rather than constantly fighting against these facts as they exist. One reason acceptance matters is that it helps support emotional resilience. Acceptance allows caregivers to acknowledge and manage their own emotions without becoming overwhelmed by them, and sometimes begin to see small amounts of meaning or progress along the way. Acceptance can also help reduce avoidance or denial. Confronting the reality of the situation can actually make it easier to identify practical and emotional ways to cope with the demands of caregiving. It can actually also improve relationship quality. When caregivers are able to accept both the situation and their own emotional responses, whatever they might be, they're often better able to maintain supportive and compassionate relationships with the person they're caring for. Again, I want to acknowledge that acceptance takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. Emotions, even the difficult ones, might be there for a reason and often need space and time to be worked through. Sometimes that's not always space or time that we feel we have. Over time, many caregivers find that reaching a place of acceptance allows them to move forward differently. It creates room not only for the hard emotions, but also for those moments of connection and pride and even joy along the way. I've spoken with many caregivers at different points in this journey, including my own experience. And there are, certainly positive emotions and growth and different aspects that folks identify that can come from this caregiving experience. And while caregiving can be incredibly challenging, many people also find that the experience builds resilience, compassion, and strength in ways that they didn't expect. So one set of tools that has been especially helpful for caregivers comes from a therapeutic approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'll talk briefly about on the next slide. So we call this ACT. And again, I'm just introducing ideas here. I don't expect you to be experts in all of this, but wanted to kind of signpost some important concepts. So acceptance or commitment therapy, or ACT, focuses on learning to accept difficult thoughts and emotions rather than constantly trying to fight with them or push them away. So as we mentioned, caregiving often brings up a lot of intense feelings: worry, guilt, frustration, sadness. And an ACT type approach helps people learn ways to relate to those experiences differently so that they don't take over or become all consuming. There's 3 ideas from ACT that I want to share with you that I think can be particularly helpful for caregivers. The first is this idea of mindfulness and self-compassion. This simply means becoming more aware of what you're feeling in the moment and responding to yourself with the same compassion that you would offer someone else. So, for example, instead of thinking, I shouldn't feel this overwhelmed, a mindful response might sound more like, this is really hard right now. And it makes sense that I feel this way, right? You're noticing what you're feeling. Like I notice I'm feeling overwhelmed. This is really hard. And then you're validating yourself, just as we've taught you to validate your loved ones. The shift alone can reduce a lot of internal pressure. The second strategy, similar, is just noticing thoughts without getting stuck in them. I know that I, for one, can get stuck in those thought loops and ruminate over the same thing over and over if I don't interrupt that cycle. And so, caregivers, we often have thoughts like, what if things get worse? Did I do something wrong? Or should I be handling this better? So, an ACT type approach doesn't try to eliminate those thoughts, it makes space for them because all thoughts kind of naturally come and go. Instead, it teaches people to notice them as thoughts rather than immediately believing them as truths or needing to react to them. So, for example, instead of thinking, I'm failing as a parent, someone might learn to say to themselves, I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that I'm failing. And this might sound like an insignificant or very subtle shift, but this is the same type of strategies that we use with young people in therapy. And just that little shift changes that thought from I'm failing as a parent as truth to giving yourself a little bit more space to I'm noticing that that's a thought. That just gives it a little bit less power, a little bit less it takes up less space, you get less stuck in it. And so, just even those subtle shifts of creating more mental flexibility and thinking about noticing and thinking about your thoughts in a different way can actually have a tremendous impact on our well being. The third strategy from ACT that I want to highlight is what we call values based actions. So, this means asking yourself, and it could apply to any area of your life, but in this context, what kind of caregiver or parent do I want to be? Even in a difficult situation like this. For some people, that might mean continuing to show patience and compassion, even when things are stressful. For others, it might mean prioritizing their own well being, setting boundaries, or asking for help. So, even on difficult days, caregivers can still take small actions that align with their personal values, whether that's attending a support group, taking any little nugget of time for self care, or even having a calm conversation with their loved one. The idea is that when circumstances are hard, our actions can still reflect what matter most to us when we think about things in a values-based way. So, don't mean to keep emphasizing, these difficult emotions, but as we're thinking about strategies, not everything has to be processed, but often it can be helpful if there can be some space to process the difficult emotions that comes up. That doesn't mean the moment that your loved one is diagnosed or things like that. This can really happen on your own time frame. Um, but as we discuss these common feelings of grief, loss, guilt, anger, even trauma, especially if the onset of the illness was sudden or involved a crisis situation, um, it's common to have these difficult emotions come up. And because of that, when possible, it's important for caregivers to have some type of outlet, often to work through these emotions, both for their own well being and to help support the person they're supporting. So, taking time to try to process these is not selfish. In many ways, it's just as important as the caregiving role itself. Um, there are different ways people do this. For some, and it's often one of my biggest recommendations, therapy or counseling can provide a helpful space to talk through that experience. And I know I'll share some resources for accessing that. I know that there can be barriers to accessing care, but sometimes we are able to find things that are covered for our insurance. And maybe it just even gives us 1 hour a week or every other week where the focus gets to be on us, even if the other however many weeks or hours are in a week are focused on our caregiving. Carving out that little space to kind of to have some professional help or dedicated time can be really helpful. Um, Others find that, journaling or talking to a trusted friend or family can help them get their thoughts or emotions out of their heads. And that helps, stopping some of that rumination or feeling so alone or isolated. Um, Another helpful shift that many caregivers describe is learning to notice and celebrate progress. I know Aisha mentioned that earlier of, thinking about the day to day. So even if things feel small, it's important to celebrate those wins. Instead of comparing the loved one to how they were before the illness or symptoms began, it can be helpful to focus on week to week, month to month. And when we do that, we often notice meaningful moments that we might otherwise have missed. Those can be moments of pride, joy, and even connection with our loved one. At the same time, it's really important to hold hope for recovery, and for the possibility that our loved one can still move forward toward meaningful goals. They might look different than originally expected, or they might not, right? Folks experiencing psychosis and schizophrenia absolutely can live meaningful lives, achieve their goals, have families, meaningful relationships, be doctors, lawyers. I've worked with folks across so many different domains. And especially when we kind of get in there early, we actually expect that recovery in psychosis is the expectation, not the exception. Now on the next slide, I'm going to talk about another common experience, right? I've already alluded to it a bit, but worry that can start to feel constant or overwhelming, right? When someone we care about is going through a serious mental health challenge, it's very common to spend a lot of time thinking about what might happen next, worrying about symptoms returning, making the right treatment decisions, or being concerned about future setbacks. Over time, that worry can make problems start to feel bigger or more unsolvable than they actually are. So, one strategy that folks use, we use this as, psychologists and when we're working with clients, is some folks find it helpful to set a dedicated time to think about a problem. Some people call it a worry time. And they're like, all right, I'm going to give myself 15 minutes at some point in the day where I'm actually actively going to think about this. And it can help reduce rumination. It can help delay um, worry. And, sometimes we don't even need to use that time, but even just telling ourselves, hey, maybe you're in the middle of a work day and a thought pops up about your young person, or you get a call from school or from the doctor and you feel like it derails things a little bit. You can kind of tell yourself like, okay, this is important and this is not an emergency right now. I'm going to spend some time thinking about this at whatever time it might be. I suggest that you don't do it right before bed. It's not the best, but sometimes it's all we have. But so this kind of delayed worry or setting a worry time can be a helpful therapeutic strategy that you can implement. Um, Another helpful strategy is to take the problem outside of our head. So we've talked to this, but finding, someone you trust can not always the easiest, but talking through the issue with them. It could be a therapist, it could be a friend, a family member, or even making a list, writing it down of possible next steps, again, can just help create a little distance and bring some organization from the worry and make problems feel more manageable. Folks have probably heard about SMART goals, right? When things feel so kind of big and overwhelming, like how am I going to help this big goal of how am I going to help my young person recover or live the life that they imagine? That's a huge, overwhelming goal, right? Even if that's what's in the background or the long-term vision. But we can break that down into what's the next best step, what's the next most important thing to do, and make a specific, measurable, achievable, or kind of relevant goal. Other just practical things that can be helpful as you're wondering, what do I need to worry about? How do I prevent this? Is keeping records, records of appointments, hospitalizations, important conversations with providers. I certainly know that as a provider myself, when families have a helpful, written history or detailed things of what symptoms look like or events, it can be really helpful in figuring out the whole picture. And that's something that really that you can do. It's tangible, and you can also kind of get some of those ideas again out of your head and onto the paper. And you can also try to plan ahead. for stressful situations. We've got a holiday coming up or gatherings, transitions, thinking ahead, including possibly with the treatment team if your young person's treatment connected, can be really helpful. Great. Um, so related to that thinking ahead, I do want to mention planning for early warning signs. We've talked about this in previous workshops, so I'm not going to spend too much time on identifying every type of warning sign, but right as we're often faced with that question of what is this going to happen again, or what do I need to look out for? We can do very tangible, practical things such as learning to recognize early warning signs and having a plan should they emerge for our young person, should symptoms of psychosis become exacerbated or return. One of the hardest things about caregiving that many people say can be that uncertainty and constant worry. And so planning ahead can help us regain a sense of control in a situation that can often feel unpredictable. Um, a lot of people think that symptoms of psychosis return without any warning of all, but often there are smaller changes that happen first. Things like changes in sleep or increased withdrawal or restlessness or pacing. Someone stops their meds, increases in substance use. It varies for person to person, but there are some common ones. So figuring out what those signs are for your young person, this could be a collaborative effort, with them and with the treatment team, can really help you learn to pay attention to those patterns over time and kind of recognize what to look for so it doesn't feel like things are just kind of coming out of the blue or that we have no control or ability to anticipate a situation. When there's a plan in place, knowing who to contact, what steps to take, and when to reach out for help can help reduce that worry and help caregivers feel more confident and effective in their role. And so on the next slide, again, covering a lot of different strategies. This will all be available for your reference. Ways that families, again, can feel empowered. We talked about that creating a supportive environment, temporarily reducing some expectations. So one way is trying to create a cool and calm emotional environment in the home, reducing household tension. So I'm not going to go through everything in here, but highlighting a couple main points. Think about trying to maintain a calm home environment. Structure and predictability can be very helpful for someone, especially as they're early in their recovery from psychosis. Keeping kind of stimulation relatively low can be helpful. All of these things are going to vary based on your young person and based on what phase of recovery they're in. This doesn't mean that you're completely changing your life and saying, I'm never going to have expectations for my young person again or never put any demands on them. That is not what I'm saying. That is not what I'm suggesting. But again, this idea of kind of going day by day, adjusting to the feedback you're kind of getting from your young person. Do they seem overwhelmed? Okay, then maybe that demand was too much for now. Let's pull back. That doesn't mean that they can't re-enroll in college or take a full course load at some point. That just means, okay, maybe right now we need to have a reduced course load, or maybe we lay off on the expectation of some chores or things that are less important. It doesn't mean you're enabling bad behavior or not allowing them to kind of grow and support autonomy. You're meeting your young person where they're at and helping them, create this calm environment, reasonable expectations, and all trying to kind of do it collaboratively with them. It's very important. So if you want to revisit this slide after with some of these specific suggestions, I encourage you to do that. On the next slide, again, available for your resources, a few closing resources that families and caregivers have found helpful. We mentioned it a couple times, but if you're able, professional support. So connecting with an individual therapist can provide a space to process the caregiving experience and work through emotions that come with it. I offered a common kind of way to search that, or if you are someone who is covered by insurance, you can contact your insurance and ask them for a list of in-network providers. I want to emphasize that you don't need to find someone who is a psychosis expert. That is certainly helpful if someone has the experience with it, but a general, therapist can help you work through the emotions that are coming with it. A lot of times families want it are it's hard to find the right fit, but they want to find someone who's got all this expertise in early psychosis or things like that, which is wonderful and beneficial. Um, but again, sometimes just getting that space, a good therapist can work with it even if it's not their area of expertise. Certainly want to emphasize connecting with other families. Listed a few resources here, such as NAMI family support groups. There's a lot in Connecticut. If you go to the website, there's various family support groups, some in person, some hybrid. There's also national ones. Even if you're not connecting individually, there's a lot of actually podcasts and videos out there of others with lived experience of caregiving, including some from the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance. The link will be on the slides. There's some from On Track New York. There's a lot of different ones there. We have some on the Step LC YouTube channel. Sometimes it can just be helpful to hear other people's caregiving stories. There's also a podcast called Three Moms in the Trenches that have some local moms who talk about their experience. Of course, empowering yourself to learn more about psychosis, attending trainings like this, we really appreciate that. And then when you have the capacity, right, building caregiving skills, such as attending some of our other workshops, reviewing them. Here's some additional resources about cultivating self-compassion. The Psychosis Reach initiative is a bit more interactive. They also have a curriculum you could work through, similar to some of the workshops that we've offered that can offer evidence-based skills for caregivers. So as we close up, I just want to mention the central message of today is that supporting the caregiver matters. Caring for someone experiencing psychosis can be incredibly meaningful, but it can also be demanding and unpredictable. Many caregivers find themselves carrying a great deal of responsibility, worry, and emotional weight. And one of the most important ideas we hope that you leave with today is that taking care of yourself is not separate from caregiving. It's part of being an effective caregiver. Those strategies like processing difficult emotions, building skills, planning ahead, and trying to connect with others can all make the caregiving journey more manageable. And most importantly, we hope you know that you don't have to navigate this experience alone. There are communities, resources, and supports available, and some of the ones that I listed, I hope that they can be supportive for you.